Welcome everyone to the episode 12 of the Office Hours podcast. This is the lo-fi version. I am traveling, so no fancy lighting and green screens and all that kind of stuff. Using a different mic too, so audio quality may be a little bit different, so hopefully that's all right. But, even though we're traveling, we're still continuing to do the podcast. So happy to see you all here and welcome Mo as usual. How's your day going?
It's going good. It's almost Friday, so it's going good. Looking forward to it. Actually, I've been I've not been doing as much because I'm on vacation, so I'm enjoying the time as well. But also, you know, even though you're on vacation, you still want to have some things done, just so you don't lose all the time. I don't know if that's a good thing though. Do you work while you're on vacation?
Do I work while I'm on vacation? Not really. I mean, there's always this, oh yeah, we're gonna go on vacation, but you can take a couple of days doing work, so you can not have to take as many off days. Never usually works out because you just end up not really working fully productively. It's kind of hard, everybody's going to the beach or everybody's going to some tour, and you're like, oh yeah, I have to stay in a hotel room working, and it's like just not nice. So, if you go on a
Yeah,
vacation, might as well just disconnect and, enjoy it.
yeah, but you know. Yeah, yeah, that's what I think. But I planned all these things to do, and now I just trying to get myself to follow through. But other than that, it's going good. Having fun and all that. So today, what I wanted to discuss with you today is mostly about crafting quality code reviews. So yeah, um, it's a pretty interesting topic that I've seen a few incidents or scenarios around it and in the like, as my career has been going and in recent times. But, you know, I think it's very important to talk about these kind of things because um, it's a very important source of like, development, like, and also to ensure like you have quality code, you need code reviews. But sometimes it's a bit difficult to craft and also to receive. And so, but I'm curious, like, how do you feel generally about like the impact of code reviews as to like code quality itself?
Right. That's a good question. No, I think, excuse me, code reviews are very important, mostly because, you know, a lot of people on the team, they're all going to have slightly different sets of expertise. Some people might know business domain better. Some people might know the code base better in certain cases. Like maybe
Mhm.
somebody's working on front end, they know various React gotchas or what have you. What are you using? Some people could look at the business side of things and say, oh, this process works slightly differently than is described here. So a lot of these kind of things get discovered usually in the code review. So our policy is that people at least give it a casual sort of look over and see if anything stands out. Then there's, aspects of compliance with formatting, which is mostly alleviated with automated tools. Usually there's no need for having to nitpick on formatting. You just configure the tools. We already had that discussion about, where does one place their semicolons, but yeah, like have a tool, have it configured, have it run. So you don't have to waste time on it in a code review. And then the other big thing for me is code smells and adherence to practices. So certain classes of things, the code review tools like automated tools, linters, they can't really necessarily detect. In some cases, maybe like you're placing the files in appropriate folders, But when it comes to the analysis, like variable naming or some bizarre patterns of function calls or something like that, like the smells, like you look at this code and like, that seems kind of, that looks a little bit off to me. Maybe the intent is not clear behind it, or maybe you have a function named a certain way that does things that are not congruent with the name, and it also has a comment on top that tells you yet a third story about what that function is doing, supposedly, right? And so to avoid confusion, it's always good to kind of clean these things up. And lately, so we've been in a crunch mode, so we kind of were allowing more things to get past it than normal. And now comes time to kind of have a look around at everything that went in and figure out where the refactors need to go. So I've designated myself a benevolent dictator for life across multiple repos. So now a lot of them require my personal sign off for code review before stuff gets merged. So hopefully I won't be a bottleneck for my team, but at the same time, we can't allow certain things to go in all willy-nilly. At least there should be something there. Either we identify those things ahead of time and say, okay, we'll fix it later. And in those cases, it's not simply, oh yeah, we'll fix it later. Now, at least it has to have like a link to a pre-existing Jira ticket that already outlines like how it's supposed to be fixed. So like these things are at least in a backlog, which is much better than just saying, yeah, we'll fix it later, and then like not coming back to this thing at all. The problem with backlog is that it might never get prioritized. Some refactors, they sort of stay in that we'll do it later mentality for quite a long time, but that's like a completely separate problem.
It's a really good, neat plan that you have, because even in crunch mode, like it's good to make the plan to fix than to make the plan after everything is already in, and then start looking for where it is, because then it's probably difficult to find. But you were saying something about automation, and you mentioned that some of the things that you would normally review, which some people would do like formatting, but I think there are also like some automated tools these days for reviews. I'm curious, do you think the entire process of like code reviews can like be automated? Do you think that would be sufficient, even if it gets like fully automated? Like,
Maybe. I mean, with the advances in AI these days, I think the biggest problem is that it needs to understand the intent behind it, right? Because I mean, you can have perfectly syntactically valid code that makes no sense in terms of like the business process. So I don't know, maybe there's going to be some AI which is able to read the specifications from Jira and then see how well the code implements it.
yeah,
Maybe. But for now, I think still humans have to do it. Just I don't know if there's any way around it. You can automate certain bits and pieces of it, and linters are great at like very, very mundane things and nitpicky things. Yeah. There was recently a video about like not nitpicking on things. Just like leave it be if it's not that important, which I think is valid. But I think maybe that, I don't know. I would have to first I have to look at my own reviews and try to figure out if they're nitpicky or they're actually there's a point to what I'm trying to say. Um, Usually, I think maybe it's better to have a more stricter review in a sense, because allowing some degree of sloppiness potentially feels like might lead to more sloppiness. Or maybe I'm completely wrong about it and should just relax a little bit. But I don't know. I don't think my code reviews are that bad. Usually they're like in a suggestive form. Um, and in terms of nitpicks as well, I think it's more annoying when you say, oh, you forgot a semicolon, but now with the suggestions feature, you can just put the patch for the semicolon and a person can just click apply, and you're not making them make that much extra work. And it also reinforces some things about like coding style, or maybe, like, for example, again, comes down to personal preference maybe, but I think my argument is valid for this case. But well, we write in TypeScript, and a lot of times I see people put return types on functions in TypeScript. And personally, I'm not for it because, compiler can figure it out perfectly well on its own 99% of the time. And if you have to explicitly put like type hints on returns, to me, that signifies that maybe the function is being a little bit weird. And so whenever I see things like return types on functions, like, hey, there's no need to put return types on functions. If you remove it and just hover over the function, it'll likely gonna generate exactly same return type for you. So like, why bother? And then, that's kind of my approach on it. And I think these days, one of the other things that I leverage quite a lot is custom ESLint rules. You can write ESLint rules like full-blown inspectors, syntax inspectors, but there's also a version that I think it's not widely known, but it's a no restricted syntax mode where it kind of looks like CSS selectors only for your source code. So there's a website called askexplorer.net, which allows you to plug in source code and it'll parse it into abstract syntax tree for various languages. Like they have like a plethora of languages there, but they have TypeScript and ESLint as well. And you can basically see how ESLint sees your code. And then you say, oh, like when you encounter this particular structure in your syntax, you can generate a warning and you can generate a fix and doing all these things. And so I can write a quick rule that says if it sees a return type on a function, it can issue a warning and say, hey, don't put return types on functions. We don't do that here. And so it kind of, if I notice that a certain pattern that is pretty obvious is being repeated a bunch of times, sometimes I would spend like maybe a couple hours, come up with the restricted syntax rule for ESLint, plug it in, run it against the code base. It like lights up everywhere where that thing is present. And then it becomes much easier to fix because now you kind of know. So I think that those are pretty interesting ways of dealing with that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, but you see, like these are the kind of things I had in mind when I was talking about one of it actually. When I was talking about the automation process in code reviews. I think that's actually one way, like proactive, at least like some certain rules will be applied as to the code as it's been developed. But I'm curious, I know like listening to how you do your reviews, I think I probably know the answer to this, but I want you to tell me, like for you, do you think code reviews is about finding bugs, or do you think there's more to it?
I think there's more to it too. I mean, it is definitely about finding bugs, and because some bugs are maybe they're just you're interpreting the logic differently and it causes a bug, or maybe sometimes it's like an actual bug, like an off by one, or you're not checking some property and you're like it might cause a runtime exception or something. But I think it's also an opportunity to ask questions. I think it's mostly applicable to junior developers, where sometimes you see some interesting bits of code that they contribute and it starts a conversation. It's like, hey, what did you mean by that? Like, why are you doing it this way? And then through that conversation, you can identify how they're thinking about it. And you can also, if that thinking is like broadly correct, but kind of a little bit in the weeds, you can maybe give them some bits and pieces of information, like nudge them to the correct direction. So to me, it's for code reviews for junior developers, it's also like a teaching tool in a sense.
You know, Um, I I agree that it's a teaching tool for junior developers, but I don't think it's just for junior developers because personally, for me, the way I do reviews, um, I find it like a way for me to also learn, you know, but because coding is an art, I think, and different people will approach this art of different um with different styles. There can be more than one way to do something, right? And I find like sometimes if if I don't understand what I'm looking at, not like I don't understand, I know how it will work, but I'm curious to your thought process, in that sense. So, but I don't necessarily think that it's it's for junior developers because of course they will gain from it, but I think at the end of the day, it's for everyone. This is my idea, and maybe I'm maybe I'm not entirely correct, but I think everyone can benefit from it in a way. What do you think?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think you're right. When I was saying it's more for junior developers, it means as a way for me to convey something, I think the biggest impact it would have on junior developers, just because intermediates they already are more set in their ways, and like seniors even more so. But like the greatest amount of influence you can have is probably to a junior developer in that
Okay.
sense,
Yeah.
because I don't know. I think the idea that there's like one true way of doing things is pretty
Mhm.
subjective, and um, I broadly think that the way that I approach these things is pretty decent. And so, if somebody picks up that style, I don't think that's a bad thing. So I'm not going to be like super kind of dogmatic about it. But yeah, in terms of learning how other people do different things, definitely. Like you read the code, and there's a lot of different opinions on how to do things. And I think the most important part is that you can have a discussion and you can sort of defend your position and they can defend theirs, and you can arrive at some sort of common ground and figure it out. I think maybe that, sometimes maybe the GitHub comments is not the best way of doing it, because for a lot of times, like code reviews are mostly asynchronous. Like in your company, do you like dedicate time on call to do code reviews, or do you just throw it in Slack and be like review it whenever you get a chance? Like how does that work for you?
Um, we have a review column in our on our board. So we have you put the ticket there, and then when someone is available, someone can pick it up to do the review for you. Or if you want, you can put it in the channel and ask directly to everyone who is available to do the review.
But I mean, you're not like saying, oh, the entire team gets on a call and somebody presents and everybody kind of goes over the code.
No,
Yeah,
no,
because I mean, I've been in
no.
those. They tend not to be
After
that
review?
great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think okay. So I think
Interesting.
whenever I do big refactorings, I think it's worthwhile to get everybody on a call and maybe present the changes to the overall group, so that people are not surprised when they make a pull and all of a sudden like a bunch of stuff is different. I think that could be worthwhile, where it's more of a like you walk through what you've done and why you've done it. But I think in that scenario, it's really hard to be productive because most people are there and they're present, but they're like bored out of their minds, and like they're probably browsing Reddit in a separate tab while you're presenting stuff on screen. So in some cases, when I see something, it's almost nice to just call a person who did the code for a quick huddle and go over it sort of one on one. So these things kind of might work in a smaller setting, uh, but yeah, usually it's like asynchronous process. We normally ask people to request reviews in Slack, and uh, we use the code owners, so that if certain parts of the code are worked on primarily by certain people, their approval will be necessary to commit. And, I think that sometimes I've been in situations where, because we have like one person's approval is enough to merge. Well, before I set myself up as a final verdict.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I've been in a situation myself where I don't necessarily know the business domain that well because I'm fairly new. And I look at the code, I don't see any obvious things. I don't see any kind of smells or anything like that. And to me, it looks good and I approve it. And then somebody else with more experience from the business, specifically for the process, they come in and they say, oh, this is not right, that is not right. And I'm like, oof, if they were quick on a draw and merged it immediately, that would not have been good. So it's always kind of like a battle between if you put too much process, like if you require two people reviewing it, it's going to slow everything down. But at the same time, you kind of want to have at least a couple of eyes on it, or a couple of pairs of eyes on it to make sure that it's kind of been covered from different aspects. And so for certain things, like for instance, for our component library, we have added designers as approvers to GitHub. Like they don't look at code necessarily, but we usually give them a link to like Storybook or whatever that they can go and see that everything matches, and then they just click approve, so that at least we haven't submitted something that is way off of what they haven't originally proposed. But for some code bases, maybe, I don't know. It's an interesting balance. I think each team has to arrive at it on their own.
I agree, but I don't think I don't think it's enough sufficient to have just one review, but depending on the size. Um, like you said, depending on the size of the PR, or like the size of the change or the feature or whatever. But I think because I've been like, because sometimes you can do reviews and then you can probably not find anything. It's possible, but then when it gets to like the QA, say for example, if you work in a team that you have a dedicated QA and they find something, or maybe like between approval, someone finds something, um, it kind of looks like you didn't really like look enough to find what they found. So it's good to have uh, the second eyes, like the second pair of eyes to I think it's better. And but for me, um, I find like if you make a refactor and you have to call everybody to a meeting, like you said, I'm not too sure if this type of meeting is as productive as it sounds, because truly you will be informing everyone about. But I think this kind of thing can be like in a document somewhere, maybe in a conference page somewhere, and you can link it to the ticket if like anyone is really like interested, or have a comprehensive PR that actually explains everything that happened in the code. So when you're doing like traces on what happened, you can trace it to the PR because it's merged, but it's still traceable.
Yeah, no, that's a
But
good point.
just getting everybody on the call, I don't know, because I'm not going to memorize what you said. Like, so for sure, for sure, if I still have questions, I will still want to go back to a
Yeah,
source to
yeah,
find it.
yeah. That is actually a very good point. So there is one methodology that I've learned from a friend of mine. He had a blog post about it. I might have sent you the link at some point in time. I might link it in a
Yeah,
in a
possibly.
video description. But essentially, his idea was that um, the reasoning for the change should live close to the change itself, aka the commit message. And he devised like a specific format for the commit message where you sort of capture the essence of the problem that you were having and the solution that you come up with in this PR specifically to address that problem. And for me personally, I also added another paragraph to it, which I call discovered complexity. Is if you have like stumbled upon something that took you a while to figure out why or how to fix it or various things, I would document it there. And essentially each commit, because the other thing we can talk about it too, I think maybe as an interjection to this, is that what do you normally see in a PR? Do you see a PR with like 50 commits, or do you see a PR with one commit? Like what is your preference?
Um, I prefer one commit actually, but that's because depending on different people's style of working, you can find like commits like, oh, working blah blah blah
Work
feature,
in
or like,
progress, work in progress.
yeah, work something working for. So like, I don't really want to spend so much time trying to decode
Yeah.
the commit message. So
Yeah.
one, just
So
one.
yeah, usually we ask people to rebase and squash, and
Mm-hmm.
once they rebase and squash, they can provide a meaningful commit message. The other thing that we do is we also use semantic release, and that it's like a plugin that automatically generates change logs and does other things based on your commit history. So it enforces a certain convention, at least on a subject line of the commit. So usually you involve like the type, if it's like a feature or a bug fix or a chore or like CI change or test change or whatever. It has a reference to the Jira, and then it has like some subject line description of what it is. And then basically the rest of the commit body is freeform. So you could put your problem, solution, complexity paragraphs in there. So that helps with it a little bit. But usually, yeah, it's just like squash rebase everything. I think the only time where it would be permissible to have multiple commits is if you do, let's say you have an old code base that hasn't been modified by automated tools. There's a feature in Git which allows you to ignore specific commits for the purposes of git blame. So that if you look at a file and you say git blame, a lot of times before, you run the formatter and then you run git blame and suddenly your fingerprints are over every line because the formatter did the thing, but like you're on a hook for the change because you're like the last person touching it. So in Git, there's a way to ignore specific commits for purposes of blame. So you'll just skip them and go to the next one. And so in this case, you can have a PR with two commits, like one commit that does all of the formatting, for instance, and then the second commit is the one that puts the hash of the other commit into the file for ignoring. So, but normally, yeah, like one commit, good commit message. Sometimes when I leave comments for people to say, oh, you need a better commit message, they change the description in GitHub, but they leave like the commit message alone. I'm like, it's not what I meant. And the reason why I'm sort of so anal about it is because I've been in situations where you do this code archaeology and you try to figure out why a particular change was made or when it was made or what it was in reference to. And you had these commits that are like changed file X or Jira ticket blah, and then you click on the Jira ticket and it's like, oh, this Jira board has been archived and no longer available for viewing. Or they like imported it from some other Jira board, so all of the ticket numbers are now completely different. Like, and you can't find any information about it. So it's like, keep it close to the merge request itself or the commit addressing all of the things. So if I have to do archaeology, I can go back to it and say, oh, that's why they did this. Okay, that makes more sense now. So I'm pretty particular about it, and I'm being more hard on people in this regard than normal.
Yeah, but do you think it will be sufficient if like in your PR you have a link to your Jira ticket in the PR, and that way you can trace the PR in the code from the code to Git, and then in Git you have the link to the exact ticket.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying, right? Is like you see a link to Jira in the ticket, but then that board has been archived, or that project has been converted, or they switched from one ticket tracking system to another ticket tracking system. So it's like following a link on an old site, and it just gives you a 404 page not found. It's basically exactly the same thing that happens here. So it's like co-locate your knowledge about the change with the change, because those are much harder to separate. Like if you have your Git with all of its history, you're gonna have it all regardless of your Jira or whatever else. Even like if you have a local copy of the repo and you get removed from GitHub and you can no longer go online, you still have your local copy with all of the commits, with all of the logs, and with all of the reasoning captured in there. And you can also use ESLint to enforce it. But, it's not necessary for all of the commits, but it's definitely necessary for some of the commits. And I think even now, if you set up your repository where you work in a rebase style instead of merge style, you can do like fast forward with rebase. I think even GitHub and GitLab, they both allow you to edit the commit message before stuff gets merged. So you have like one more chance without doing like amending and force pushing to do the right thing and prepare like a good commit message when you mainline something.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That might be a bit much better solution for that. I picked up something you mentioned earlier when you said sometimes you you talk about the changes over Slack, like you don't necessarily have to leave all your comments or like leave the change request in the NDPR. Maybe I have a slightly different opinion about this, but just my own opinion, right? But I want to ask you, um, why do you think this is a better? Because I think if you if you leave your comments, like your change request or maybe your questions on the PR, maybe someone else can, during like you said, someone else trying to find reasons why this kind of things happen. You can read this conversation and it can be part of the document for this ticket, for this change, instead of like having the entire conversation undocumented.
Oh, no, no,
But it
no.
depends.
I think you probably didn't understand me, didn't understand what I had in mind. I didn't say that you shouldn't leave comments in GitHub. And it was more of I said that the comments in GitHub are sometimes not the best way, because it's really hard to leave like very lengthy pieces of text explaining your reasoning. It's like a lot of typing. So if it has to be a lot of typing and it's not something like fairly simple that you can apply a suggestion, to me usually it warrants a bigger conversation. Maybe you're probably right in a way that it's better to again keep the reasoning documented. So maybe it's just like, okay, well, I just have to grit my teeth and like type out the entire thing that I wanted to say. The other annoying thing is that I also noticed is, because written text in this setting does not convey the intent and does not convey the emotion. Sometimes you can read the comments somebody left on your PR and be like, oh man, that guy's such a jerk. He's just giving me all these crappy messages. It's like, how dare he tell me these things? It's like, oh, your semicolon's in the wrong place. Where I was like, oh, your semicolon was in the wrong place. It's okay, you can fix it. But he interprets it as, oh, your semicolon is in the wrong place. What a douche, right? And so because it's lacking that personal touch, it can be misconstrued. Like, for instance, a couple of days ago, I wrote somebody in Slack about something and haven't received the reply. And then a couple of days later, I write them again and I haven't received the reply. And then a couple of days later, I write again and I still don't receive a reply. And I was like this close of like typing like, man, this is borderline rude. And the guy writes me, it's like, oh, sorry, I was out sick. And I'm like, oh shit, man, it's like, okay, I was thinking that guy to be like unprofessional, but he had a very good reason not to reply to my messages, and now I feel bad, and I was like this close of like escalating it to where it didn't need to go. And so that's why even if I leave some comments, I sometimes would go on a huddle and go over them just so person has an idea that I'm not just being a dick to them, and I actually have like a valid reason for doing so, because it's really hard to convey emotion and intent. And just every time you write a response to a commit, like if on a PR, if you write a comment on PR, it just every time it comes out sarcastic, even though you don't intend it to sound like this. It's like, I don't know why, but people will interpret it. Maybe, I guess it also depends on your personal connection with the people you're working with. But like if you're new and if they don't know you too well, they might take it the worst possible way because they don't know you as a person and like how you communicate, right?
I agree. It's like texting.
Mm-hmm.
You never really know um how how it was exactly said. The words were said. You will read it in your own voice and try to add the person's voice to it, or so somewhere around that. So yeah, I agree with you. And this is one thing. Like I was curious about how to give like constructive feedback. In a way that it doesn't really like discourage anyone or like sound uncomfortable to people. Um, but constructive, like it actually helps us to have better codes or like better solutions. And I think I agree with you. I mean, I like this idea. It took a while for me to actually think about this kind of thing too, because I don't really like to talk as much, So so if I feel the need that I have to ask for this change and I need to defend why I'm asking you for this change, I would probably want to you know, just leave the conversation in the PR.
Mm-hmm.
But uh but I think it's better to do both, leave the conversation in the PR for documentation and still take an extra step to explain the reason why you are asking for this change. But the tricky part about this is I think it also depends on personalities. Some people are actually open to learning and they are actually open to being wrong or like being correctable, you know. And I don't think it's everyone in our field that that is like this. Because I also know like I said, coding is an art, you know? So some people don't think their art can be corrected, like this to them it's the perfect thing. And so the moment you have the slightest question or you question their thinking or their thought process, it's a trigger. So like they're already on the defensive, like, how dare you come to me with this question? And now you have to defend yourself, go back and forth and like debate a little bit. Sometimes it's worth it. Sometimes you just know who the person is and just move on. Just
Yeah,
does it break anything? No. Is it good? It's good. Let's move on.
certainly. I think that, you know, this type of conflict, because it is a conflict effectively, and if you're gonna bring it up, you better have a better justification for your changes than just I told you so or because that's how I want it to be done. Like it actually have to make sense, right? And I think it's kind of like uh, it's almost like a spousal therapy. It's like it's not you versus the other person, it's you and the other person versus the problem you're trying to solve. So you have to frame it in the correct terms. So it's like a lot of people would take that criticism personally, as if you're not criticizing the code that they wrote, but you're criticizing their entire way of being because they sort of identify themselves with what they write as so much. And yeah, it can certainly be difficult. So you kind of have to be, you know, a little bit of a psychologist as well, yeah, in a way, and understand the reasoning and how to, appeal to their better qualities. Um, but yeah, ultimately it has to start from, do I have a good justification for this change? Or is it just something I want to leave a comment for visibility's sake or something like that, which kind of bothers me a lot of times. Thankfully, I haven't had a chance to work with people like that in a while, but I remember working with somebody who's just like every time this person is going to pipe up and leave some comment that has barely anything to do with anything, but they're there and they're visible, and it's just like, oh my god, so I'm pretty sure you know.
Of course. Yeah, it's part of the job. It's like you said, you have to be a psychologist a little bit and just to understand people and how they work and like because once you have someone like that in your team, you have to learn how to work with this person. It's not gonna quit just because you have this type of person. Like this is their style, so you don't take it personal. Like they said, like you don't take code reviews personally anyway. It's not everybody's working, everyone is trying to make it good. So you just have to accept that. But on the flip side, I want to ask you again, how do you receive code reviews, especially when it feels you know, critical or overwhelming?
Well, I don't really code in that much of a volume these days, to be honest. Uh, Before, I don't know. I don't dwell on the past. No, I'm just kidding. But I think if I'm like, I had a couple of code reviews where people were basically against my changes, and after deliberating, I was basically agreeing with them. But that's mostly because it was a code base that was organized a certain way. It was like a legacy piece of code, and I was thinking like, why aren't we doing more modern ways of doing things? But I kind of fell into the trap that I kind of hate when it happens to me. But where you try to switch patterns, but because you're incapable of refactoring the entire application at once to completely get rid of the old pattern, now you have like old and new coexisting. And I'm thinking about it and I'm like, I'm guilty of that thing myself, because I would introduce these changes to like a couple of files that I was touching, but not doing it everywhere else. And people would come in and say, yeah, but that's not really how we do things in this code base. And even though it may be newer, better, whatever, it's just going to be confusing to everybody else. I'm like, yes, that's exactly correct. And so I was I had to revert some of that stuff and just kind of bring it into alignment with the way that things were done, which I did not enjoy personally. It was kind of grating, but in a grand scheme of things, it made sense. It's like, this is how it's done. Is it suboptimal? Yes. Is it old and crappy? Also, yes. Are we going to do anything about it? No, because we don't have resources to overhaul the entire code base, and otherwise it doesn't really make sense to do it sort of one spot here, a little bit there. Like, it's just not worth it. So yeah, I'm not above criticism and changing things where it doesn't make sense. So
Yeah, I mean, sometimes um you might find it. Have you ever found yourself in a scenario where like, you know, someone is asking you for a change? I mean, in this case that you mentioned that you described, it's like if you want to continue with the process you were working on, you would probably have to do the entire code base, probably, which means like you weren't wrong. And technically, that needs to be done really at some point when the resources becomes available for that.
AKA
But in a
never.
case, yeah, but in a case where like, say you had a function written in a certain way and someone questions your idea or like the reason why you had it written this way and suggests to write it in a different way. And you have both will actually work. But there is no visible like to the eyes to see like, oh, this code is better than this code, but the person actually suggests it, and um, now you're having conversations about this. What will you do?
I think it boils down to your mandate. Like if your mandate is to keep the application going, you would want to stick with overall style and theme. And if you are doing something way too fancy for the code base, maybe it's not the best idea. Same reasons that I just went into. However, if your mandate is to modernize and to refactor and to take it out of the dark ages, then you have to really kind of stand and protect your justifications, and be a little bit more adamant about it. Because I mean, there's change for change's sake, but there's also, on the opposite end, there's like a great resistance to change. And we picked a crappy pattern 3 years ago, and things are just the way they are because that's the way they are. We're not going to do anything about it. And sometimes people don't understand that this pattern is actively working against them. It's making things harder to change. It's making things harder to refactor. So like if you want to take this whole thing and make it more maintainable, you have to go through this painful process of redoing certain pieces, like cutting unnecessary things, changing process. And people are resistant to change in general. So every time you come in, cowboy riding on its horse, trying to just be like, I'm a new sheriff in town, it's going to be different from now on. There's going to be a lot of resistance to that, right? So that's it. It rarely works out, and that's why I think most developers prefer greenfield, is because you can do things the right way from the beginning, and then the crunch time comes in, and you start doing all the same crap that you were doing before, just in a new code base. So it's a story as old as coding itself, I would imagine. But yeah, if the idea is to deliberately make it better, then accepting old ways just because they're there and that's how we do things is not a good enough justification by that point. If it's some legacy project that's just sitting in maintenance mode, doing things as they were done is perfectly fine, because if somebody comes in and they see a consistent code base, they see a consistent crappy code base, but at least it's consistent, and consistency is better than smorgasbord of just all sorts of random bits and pieces with no rhyme or reason.
Yeah, but the scenario I was trying to describe is it's a bit different from this scenario. At least like this scenario that you're describing, there is a reason that you can visibly see. You can see like, oh, the reason why we're doing it this way is to keep it consistent with how we've been doing it. Whether crappy, whether good, whether fair, this is how we've been doing it. This is the reason. But in a certain scenario where like there is no actual reason, like you have two functions that can do the same thing. The only difference is the style of writing. And but someone prefers to have this style over this style. And now it's a matter of debating which style wins over this over this style. Um, I, I'm curious, like in this type of scenario, how, like you said, I think it's I don't know if it's conflict. I think it's just in the process of code reviews, there will be there might be scenarios like this where people want to pass their ideas as well. Like this is how you know how to do it, and you think it's the best. But at the end of the day, it's the same. If I do it this way, if I do it that way, we're going the same route. But now the choice now is whose idea should we work with?
Mm.
You know?
I
So
see what
like
you
in
mean.
this type of scenario, like how do you manage it? Would you would you concede like, well, see, if it doesn't make any difference, I'm just gonna concede and let's move on? Or would you stand your ground and be like, no, this is it. This is how I'm gonna do it, and final.
I think the older you become, the more accepting you become of these things. I would say if the person spend enough time to actually submit a suggestion that I can just apply, screw that, I'll just apply it. Who gives a shit? If they're just telling me to rewrite it in some different way because they don't like it without no good justification, I'll probably be more stubborn about it. But I haven't really been in that type of situation where that specific scenario has occurred. So I don't know. Usually the criticisms are more targeted than just boiling down to rewriting the function. I mean, I probably recently have been on a giving side of this equation where a person written like a singleton with like a protected constructor and a method that's supposed to like create an instance of a class in TypeScript, by the way, not like Java. But the method to create the instance of the class was also like an instance method on the class. So it was just kind of weirdly structured. So my suggestion was just reorganizing it where you pull the function out of the class into its own method, and you don't export the class, you just export the factory to create it. So it's just rearranging things. It didn't really change the meaning of the code. But his way was just smelly, because doing it that way, it's like, why do you need a class if the only reason to have it is to implement the singleton pattern where you can just make a factory function that will give you exactly the same thing, only cleaner? So, and they ended up accepting my version of things.
That's what I'm saying. But like you said, it doesn't really change anything. Even if maybe it's just to you that it looked that way, maybe it's acceptable to like other. I don't know. Like,
Well, I mean, I had a justification where, you have a module that exposes some kind of API, and one of the jobs of the API is to make access patterns clear. So if you're just exporting the factory to get an instance of some type, you're saying this is the blessed way to get the instance of that type. Don't go looking for other ways. But where it's like, oh, here's a class constructor, and then you can call it, and then you can call another method on it to get a different thing. It just makes it more confusing. So I'm pretty sure I was right in that case.
absolutely. I mean, I don't think you were wrong. It was just like what I'm trying to learn here is like sometimes I'm wondering like which one is a better way to handle stuff like this, because um I've worked in a team before where like most of us were pretty young. That's like a while ago, but in this team, like it was young people, and we felt the need, sometimes to show off our ideas. Like, I know this thing, so I'm gonna, bring out like all the documentations I craft out on JavaScript, everything I learned from the tutorial, and just like put it on the table and just like say something, And as I as I continued like to grow in my career, I think I'm at a point where like things like this don't really faze me that much. Like you said, like if you make it a suggestion, I'm just gonna accept it. But sometimes I wonder if it's a good thing to do, because
Yeah.
I think for someone to come to me with this type of idea and just want to like ask for this type of suggestion, I think they probably think it like it's the best thing to do, you know? And maybe I'm denying them of learning if I don't at least explain my thought process, And if after explaining my thought process and they still insist like they have a better way, if it doesn't break anything or it doesn't affect anything, it doesn't make the code bad, I don't mind conceding. But I'm not too sure if like if maybe I'm not letting them learn, or like I'm not sharing ideas, or like I don't really know if I'm doing the right thing in this process. But
Right. I see
for
what you
peace,
mean.
I don't know.
Well, when you were describing the situation in the beginning, it kind of felt like it wasn't really a matter of code, but it was more like a matter of egos, which is a different thing, right? Like code has barely anything to do with it. It's more of a, you know, what waving contest where you're just trying to ascertain who's a better developer or whatever, which is different, right? I think the normal rules don't apply because it's a different contest, and I think in this way it's probably better to defer, like get a staff member around and be like, okay, adjudicate this, like weigh in on it. But in general, I think that if you have an opinionated person on a team, I think overall it's good because it creates alignment that everyone eventually ends up gravitating around. So you have like clear vision of like it encompasses everything, because where everybody sort of don't care, wishy-washy, different styles start sprouting in the code base. It kind of get a little bit like it starts getting like more amorphous. You don't have like a one clear direction behind it. So having one person with strong opinions, which may not always be correct, there's one risk of that is like opinion, like people who are highly opinionated, sometimes they can be stuck in an opinion that isn't correct and just keep on forcing it. So there's that risk certainly. But at least then you have consistency, which again, in a lot of ways, consistency is a big deal because, you know, anywhere you look will look familiar because it has this one unifying principle behind it. Whereas if you don't have that, you open 5 different files, they follow 5 different styles, you don't know where to place yourself. It's more messy. So, but if you have multiple very opinionated people and their opinions are kind of orthogonal to one another, that is more of a team's composition issue, I would say, because it's really hard to determine who's correct in any given way, and it turns into some weird power struggle, and it has nothing to do with the code itself, and it's a personalities thing, and it's a team composition thing, I would say. So it needs to be resolved by other means.
Yeah. But which means would you recommend in this kind of scenario? You mean like aside from involving a staff developer who knows nothing about what we're doing, but probably can help?
But
Um,
see, maybe that's a good thing, because if you bother a staff developer and it's like, why are you bothering me with this stupid bullshit for? Like smacks both of you and goes away, and you're like, okay, well, I guess we've been told, and the conflict evaporates. So yeah, I think these things are very case by case basis. It's more that if you have this ongoing, consistent conflict with some person who's just constantly like shutting down your PRs or like overly critical in those PRs. But again, if that's the level of the discussion, it probably has nothing to do with code and there's other things at play. But if it's just, do it my way versus do it my way, I think that like you can't have two people drive the car at the same time. There has to be one clear leader. And again, if there's like this sort of internal struggle for the leadership position, it's up to the team's manager to sort that out. It's just not really conducive for a good developer experience for all involved, both people who are in a state of conflict and everybody surrounding them, because cliques are going to form, there's going to be resentments on both sides. It's just it turns into a complete shit show right away. And so if it's a big organization, maybe you just need to split people into 2 different teams with different responsibilities, so they don't have to do that. They will have their own domain and they'll rule over it and be happy. And if you put them together where they constantly like butt heads, not really good for all involved.
yeah,
Or quit.
yeah,
You can
I
always
agree
quit.
with that. I mean, hopefully it doesn't come to that, but I agree.
Yeah,
But
if you're more Machiavellian, you might start plotting against the other person and make them quit. But I never been that evil, so that's not really my style. But I know people out there who would not like. There's people who would consider it and just like spreading rumors and doing shit to get you fired or something like that. I mean, people are people. What are you gonna do?
that's dark. That's really dark. Oh, anyway. It's just a job. Anyway, um, I wanted to ask you a question about for you, which review have you had in your, can you remember, that left a very long lasting impression on you?
Hmm. Well, I think out of the very long lasting impressions, it was very early in my career. And basically, I was working for a small consulting company. And for the in the beginning, we were building a lot of our stuff in PHP way back in the day. And we had to build a new product for a customer using ASP.NET, which was this web development framework from Microsoft. That's like predating MVC, so it's just web forms. I think it was
Yeah,
ASP.NET 2.0. It wasn't all in
yeah,
Visual Basic, it was C Sharp by then, but it was not PHP. And I remember writing a whole bunch of things as if it was PHP. And when my boss looked at it, he was like, "Oh, what the heck are you doing? It's not the way you're supposed to do things here. There's abstractions, there's these helper methods, there's these classes that like sort this out for you." And I was like, "Wow, I had no idea." And so that did leave a lasting impression because I remember that happening every once in a while. It's like, yeah, I was using, man, I remember this video where there's this young guy and he has this pneumatic drill to get the tiles off a wall, and then his colleague come over and is like, "Hey, can you show us how you do it?" And he like picks it up and like starts slamming the wall, and they're all laughing because the tool is not plugged in. And he already like cleared half of the wall by just like brute forcing it. But if he were to plug it in to make the reciprocating bit actually reciprocate, it would have been 10 times easier. He just didn't know. And so I was basically in the exact same situation. I was leveraging this high power tool without turning it on. I still achieved what I had to achieve. It was just like through way more hoops I had to jump through to get it there. And when he turned it on for me, I was like, oh, wow, mind blown.
yeah. Would you say, this is really, actually, I think this is a very um educative kind of review, because like it stayed with you for this long. Um, but do you think this type of reviews influenced your style of giving feedback on codes?
I don't necessarily remember the style in which that feedback was given necessarily. I think that my feedback style probably is evolving. I don't know if it's always the right thing to do because a lot of times I try to be sort of overly diplomatic, where maybe sometimes I just need to be more direct and not try to kind of, butter them up before. So it's, I think that maybe the style and code review, where again, I used to work with a lot of people who were complete beginners, and it's a different communication style because you have to first identify things that they don't understand. So you kind of have to coax out of them how they arrived at a certain solution, why they think that that solution makes sense, identify the gap in their knowledge and in their thinking, and then try to sort of start from that level and build it up. So where my explanation of why they did the thing wrong starts making sense, right? So it's like it's fairly elaborate, and I think I've gotten pretty good at it while like teaching people who have zero skill, like complete beginners. But I think that this starts to translate into things where I have to be like more firm, especially more firm about like saying no to things. And I always like fall down to my diplomatic sort of wishy-washy kind of approach. So, good for one thing's not so good for the other things.
So what kind of advice would you give um, to developers now, from like all the years of experience of like code reviews that you had? What kind of advice would you give to developers in terms of receiving code reviews, and also in terms of like giving it as well?
So in terms of giving it, well, obviously it's not universal. It depends on the target of your criticism, because I guess the first assumption is that people have reasons for why they write the code the way they write it. And if you can identify those reasons, you can be more understanding. And if it makes sense, like if you're more sort of empathetic to their position, certain things start to make sense, and then you can just let go your criticism, because it's like, yeah, you know what, fair enough. Like, now that I know what they had in mind, sure, it'll work. It doesn't really bother me. So approaching it from a position is like, they wrote it for a reason. If it's wrong, it's an opportunity to identify the gaps again, as I mentioned before, right? And have some corrective action there. Like, they're not writing crappy code to spite you and cause you irritation. So if you start your code review being irritated, you're already failing, because that's not the point, right? The other side of it is, if you explain something to somebody like 4 times and they still do the same stupid bullshit, that gets me hella irritated, because mostly, in a professional environment, like, you should only be told like twice. If you have to be told 3 times the same thing, it's not really not a good look, right? Thankfully, I haven't really had too many people working with me where that would be the case. Like, for some of the students that I had, there were some people who like explain something to them, and it's just like, you know, not even that. Okay, sorry, let me rephrase. Because dealing with complete beginners, some explanations can certainly fly over their head, and that's your problem as an instructor. You have to find ways to explain it in metaphors that they will understand. And I remember I had like 3 or 4 different go-tos for like most common things, and I would start with one, and if I see that the person doesn't get it, I would like switch to another, and if they still don't get it, I would switch to yet another, and eventually I get my point across, because you can see them understanding. The problem is like, if I explain something to somebody and I can see that they're understanding it, and then a week later they're doing the same thing and I have to explain it again, and then a week later they do yet the same thing again, that stuff starts pissing me off, because like, well, what the heck, I've explained it 3 times, like, why are you still doing this? It shows kind of like the inability to learn. Because, I mean, explanations is one thing, and understanding in the moment also, it's an important part too. Understanding in the moment happens. There is a video on YouTube where a guy is writing an implementation of Game of Life in APL dialogue. And as you're watching this 12-minute video, you can follow along and you can understand what's going on, and it makes a lot of sense. Every step that he's doing, it's like, okay, I can see where this is going. He's like folding these matrices, he's like doing these transforms, and boom, you have this weird APL dialogue Game of Life implementation in this really bizarre language. 20 minutes later, if you look at it, it'd be like, I have no freaking idea what's going on, because it is a complicated thing. So you could have understanding in a moment and then lose it entirely. But if your job depends on not losing it entirely, yeah, not so great.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for the advice. I think it wraps everything for me. At the end of the day, I think the process of um code reviews is deeply more human than most of it. Like, you just have to have more grace, and also to also have more um understanding, and try to understand the effort that the other person is putting into it as well.
Yeah, and
So yeah,
patience too.
and patience, and
Mhm.
patience. Yeah, very much patience, because like you said, like, we learn at different speeds, and maybe it's possible for someone to need 3, 4, 5 times of telling. It's not a good look, I agree, but
Yeah,
we all learn at different speed,
yeah,
and
and
like,
yeah, you have
it
different
is what
people
it
have
is.
different approaches to like receiving information. As I said, like some metaphor that works for like 90% of the people completely doesn't work for the rest of them. It's strange, but like to me and 9 people out of 10, it makes perfect sense. But for that one person, they just like, and I started explaining it from a completely different way. So that then the 90% are like, what the heck is he talking about? But that person is like, oh, okay, I get it now. And if you have a lot of knowledge about some subject, does not automatically make you qualified to teach on that subject, because I think the process of translating that knowledge into something digestible is a dedicated skill that not everybody has, you know.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, I don't know about programming because it's expressed in language and it's expressed in text. It's a little bit different, but like, I don't know. If you ask some virtuoso violinist how to play a violin, he probably does so much of it by feel, he wouldn't even able to verbalize how he does it, right? So at least in this case, we have tools for verbalizing how we do it and why we do it. So it's a little bit easier. But yeah, teaching somebody skills, it's also a skill within itself. So, and you can get better at it too. And the other interesting thing is that in the process of explaining things, you get better understanding of those things yourself. So, you know, if you have an opportunity to mentor a more junior on your team, take it, because it'll give you additional clarity on the thing. Like for instance, I remember when like async await in JavaScript came about a couple of years back. Well, I don't know, not a couple, like I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years back. I don't know when it happened, but a while ago. But it was like a new thing. And obviously people had questions, especially if you haven't really programmed in that paradigm before. And you know, as I was trying to explain how it works, after a certain iteration of explaining it to yet another person, it was like, okay, now I have a really good understanding of how it works, because you know, it's like, oh yeah, they use generators, and then they do these, you know, anyway. I remember having this sort of clarity moment about how this thing works internally after explaining. Like I could intuitively understand how it was working, but I didn't know specifically how it was working. And through that process of explaining it to other people, I gained deeper appreciation for it myself. And, you know, now I know it even better. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Vasili. So that'll be all from me today. That's what I wanted to discuss with you, and thank you for your advice.
Sure.
Um, hopefully I remember everything so I can give better better
Uh,
reviews. For sure. I keep them to heart, but um, it comes with practice. I
yeah.
don't know
Yeah. Practice
because
too.
yeah,
And, you know,
practice.
this video will be posted on YouTube eventually. So even if you forget, you can always revisit it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, it's
Next
good to
episode is going to be the spooky number 13. Still likely going to be
yeah.
a lo-fi session. But anyway, thank you, Mo, for the discussion today. And thank you, everybody who's watching. We've gained a couple of new subscribers recently. So thank you guys for being the OGs.
Thank you.
I probably forgot to plug the Telegram and Discord and the whole thing. So I'll plug it now. Join the Telegram, join the Discord. The links will be in the description. Share, like, and subscribe. And thank you for giving us your time and watching this. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.